Angelica, what was the moment you decided that news was for you?
I was very young. I was in elementary school, and I really loved watching these news anchors in Boston, Chet Curtis and Natalie Jacobson. And I did that thing where I pretended I was a news anchor. I would line up my stuffed animals and read the Boston Globe to them. And we played jobs on the street with my friends, and one would be a waitress and the other one would work at a bank, and I was always the newscaster. So as you can imagine, when I go home, they bring it up every time. Like, you've been doing this since you were 7 years old. And it's truly a miracle that I actually went to journalism school and stuck with it, because it was just some weird thing that I was obsessed with when I was a little kid, and I stuck with it. What about you?
Well, I mean, I can relate because when I was 7 years old, I wanted to be an astronaut. And after my third tour at the International Space Station, I thought, what a cliche. It's ridiculous. No, I never envisioned myself as a newscaster, although it's funny because my mother always said I should be a journalist. And then I took journalism classes in high school, and then I transferred to another high school where they didn't have it. So I stopped. I got really into doing radio stuff like DJing and things like that. And then when I finally got to University of Oregon, I realized that you can't major in radio. So I major in television, and it wasn't like some burning passion. It's just something that developed as time went on.
So the U of O has no radio majors?
No, not that I know of. I don't think it's a major most places anymore.
Yeah, we had a huge radio department. And we were actually, as broadcast journalism students, were forced to take the radio classes, and it was a privilege if you ask me, but we were required to do newscasts on our college radio station, WERS, which is actually a pretty good college station. And it was a big deal. It was like one of the best, student run radio stations in the country. But I get it. I mean, like, people don't get into radio anymore. Aren't most people on the radio like, it's automated and it's, across the country you get what is Charlie FM and this and that. There aren't that many radio jobs left.
Yeah, for sure. I did work for the college radio station at U of O, KWVA. I was the production director, which was weird because I wanted to do that. And then I got in there and I was told that staff members couldn't have shows. And the whole reason I even wanted to go on there was to play rap music on the radio. And I was told I couldn't do that. So I was the voice. This nasally, high-pitched voice was the voice of the college radio station for like a year. And then I was able to have a show, and I got the coveted 3 a.m. slot. So it was pretty great.
Wait, so staff members couldn't have shows? They put you right into management?
Yeah, well, we're all 20 years old. What do we know?
Exactly. I loved working in college radio. I was actually in the newsroom the day that Kurt Cobain died, and everyone freaked out. And there was a big, huge fight over what to lead with. And every single person in there, except for the student news director, it's like, Kurt Cobain just killed himself. This is a college radio station. It's 1994. That's the lead. And he didn't think we should lead with it.
What did he want to lead with?
I don't know. He was like this super newsy kid who wasn't into music. And someone came in. I think it was like a graduate student came in and was like, you got to get out of here. Kurt Cobain is the lead here and on every TV station and radio station in the country right now. So it was kind of interesting to see that play out, because it was the first time I'd ever seen like people butt heads over editorial decisions.
Well, speaking of butt heads, we have a guest today, and we'll get to him in just a second. Let's just start the show. Welcome to Film Swap, the podcast where we challenge each other to watch the movies that we've let slip through the cracks or purposely shoved into the cracks for whatever reasons. I'm Nick Voll.
And I'm Angelica Thornton, and this week we are talking about Nightcrawler.
I'm starting a TV news business.
You, get back!
I film breaking stories. Maybe you saw my item this morning, you were fatal carjacking.
No, I don't have a TV.
Do you have a cell phone?
Yeah.
Does it have GPS?
Yeah.
Congratulations, you're hired.
Okay. We're taking the next right. That's too fast!
Repeat the police. I will never ask you to do anything that I wouldn't do myself. Excuse me, I have something you'll be very excited about.
You have a good eye. I want you to contact me when you have something.
Something like this.
Think of our newscast as a screaming woman running down the street with her throat cut.
You will be seeing me again.
I I think Lou is inspiring all of us to reach a little higher.
Nightcrawler is a 2014 American neo-noir psychological thriller film written and directed by Dan Gilroy in his directorial debut. Stars Jake Gyllenhaal as Lou Bloom, a stringer who records violent events late at night in Los Angeles and sells the footage to local television news station. And the news director there is Rene Russo. Riz Ahmed is in this movie, and Bill Paxton as well. We, as you probably have noticed, have a very special guest with us today. Local comedian / television news legend Carl Click.
Yay, Carl.
Is it a good thing that comedian comes before news now in my career?
Well, it's your encore career, right?
Well, I don't get a lot of encores on stage, but yeah.
Oh, come on.
It's what I'm doing now.
So we need to tell people how we all know each other. I started working at K2 News in 2007, and Carl was the morning news anchor and Nick was the morning news producer. I think at that time, Nick, you were producing the entire show by yourself.
Yeah, I was doing a 2-hour show by myself with one writer.
Yeah. And I came from Boston, and Carl Click was my first anchor in Portland.
As we say, one of our many TV news husbands or wives, because that's basically what the relationship is.
I think you're my favorite so far.
That's of all, or just in Portland at K2?
No, of all. We how long did that last, you guys? A year? And then I was demoted to the 4:00 news.
Well, as was I.
That's true. Nick and I left you on the mornings, and then you were here for a million more years. And
I was with Natalie and Rhonda until 2014.
That's right. So, and you were in news 31 years?
Yep.
KGW?
Yep. 22
K2?
years at KGW and 9 at K2.
Okay. So this is going to be a really good conversation about Nightcrawler. All three of us have worked in news, and all three of us have done the overnight shift. So we've had to deal with stringers.
So one of the standard questions we ask here in this podcast right at the beginning is, why have you guys not seen this movie? It's about the industry that you've devoted your lives to. Why haven't you seen it?
I skipped over it because I think I tend to avoid all films and shows related to TV news. I only enjoy one, broadcast news, because I think that one, although at the time it was supposed to be kind of over the top, but it's spot on. And everything else disappoints me. It's exaggerated. It's not realistic. So I think I tend to avoid it. I tried to watch the Apple TV show, the morning show. I've tried to watch a bunch of stuff, and it's just, I get annoyed and I have to turn it off. What about you, Carl?
Nick, it was 2014. Is that right?
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. So the reason I didn't watch it is because that's the year that I got out of TV news and wanted nothing to do with it for quite a long time. Although I appreciate the fact of watching it now, because I really enjoyed, trying to pick apart what's real, what's not, what's exaggerated. I agree with Angelica. Broadcast news, while a little bit hokey, is a perfect romantic comedy about TV news.
So you didn't find Lou and news director's romantic relationship to be romantic?
No, that was ridiculous. That was the most ridiculous part about the entire show.
I have so much to say about it, but the headline for me is, I hated the way this movie made me feel. The anxiety ruined my Saturday morning. Like, I was sweating the whole time. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't a good film. It was good, and the acting maybe was a little too good. Jake Gyllenhaal was really freaking me out.
Oh, yeah, he's excellent. I think, but what I noticed is that I mean, his voice, his cadence, it got him into that really kind of off the spectrum kind of dude in this business, and his body language when he was walking. I was thinking other actors, you get Kevin Costner, Michael Caine, even other people. They're like the same guy in each movie. Jake Gyllenhaal, it transforms into this role. He's not the guy he was in Brokeback Mountain. He's not the guy that was, Sunday in the Park with George on Broadway. He really shows his versatility.
I think that this demonstration of a sociopath is so well done, because you can tell he knows what to say to everyone. He can just read what they want to hear and says it. I think that I mean, we can talk about the realism of the movie. Obviously, it's very hyper, you know.
Yeah, it's exaggerated.
Thank
Totally.
you. But what worked for you? What rang true to you about this movie?
Well, the one thing that I wanted to correct was that Rene Russo's character is called the morning news director.
Yeah.
And she is not that. She is the overnight producer, and she does have all the decision making powers that she had in that role. But to call it the news director is never there overnight, and that was just a mislabel of a character. And I couldn't believe that if they had any kind of TV news consultant for the script, that they would have fixed that little tiny thing.
Totally. Yeah. Or they didn't care because news director just sounds more impressive than executive producer. But yeah, so for those of you who are not in television news, the news director is basically the big boss man or woman over the entire news station that would never be working overnight like that. It would not be so hands-on necessarily in the production of the show.
Yeah, and let's be honest, that news director is never going to deal with stringers, only setting the budget for how much you can pay for video or sending email saying, we can't buy any stringer video this week. We've already hit our budget.
Yeah, or second guessing the decision to buy the video. Why did you buy that?
Yeah. Yeah. And they're not even really deciding on the leads most of the time. You've got executive producers doing that. I mean, they get in there on the meetings. But if they had a consultant in here fact checking for accuracy, the movie wouldn't have been made. So I think we could just say right off the top, it's not a very realistic representation of the way a newsroom functions, not just because it was so beyond unethical, all of the different things that were happening.
Yeah, I disagree that it wasn't a good representation, Angelica. I think it was just exaggerated because the ethics questions that they deal with are ethics questions that we deal with all the time in news, whether you're going to show a body or not, or whether you're going to, whether the stringer was ethical about how they shot things. And
right.
They just, the problem was they landed on the wrong side of the ethical question every single time.
Exactly.
My favorite character was the assignment editor guy who always came and said,
Frank would never have the power in a real newsroom. Frank does not have that much power.
But he was right every time.
He was. They had the assignment editor who, not to say assignment editors don't work their butts off, but this guy was coming in and calling decisions into question and making the editorial decisions. And they don't do that. They dispatch crews, they get information, they share it. So just another one of those little details that you're like, okay, I have to look past this. I get the point that they're trying to make.
But they just made him into the other voice on the shoulder of that news decision.
Yeah.
You do it. It's going to be great. You can't do it. It's unethical. And he was right every time. And they chose the opposite direction because it made the better movie. Showing bodies, that's ridiculous. That we would never do that. And everybody knows that.
Yes. You worked in news, over 30 years. I've worked in news almost 27 years. And I was trying to think as I was watching this, has there ever been a decision that I had a problem with as far as showing something that was graphic or, that left me feeling like, wow, that was a really bad call, ethically, journalistically, whatever you want to say. I don't think that's ever happened. I got into one fight with a producer once, and it was like I was left in tears. I did not want to do it. In the end, I gave in because it was one of those, you have to do it. And it was nothing like any of the scenarios in this film.
Nick, you were involved as the producer of the morning show in those kind of decisions a lot. When you were the lead producer, I mean, you were the main voice because overnight there are no managers, there are no news directors. That can be difficult when that's on your shoulders.
Sure. But the thing is there's a few things. Well, first off, Portland's not LA, right? So there's less pressure to be as sensational. At least there was when I was working in it. Although I think I think this movie is prescient in a lot of ways in the way that, TV has to push boundaries now to get people to watch. But yeah, so we made decisions about what to show and what not to show. But honestly, if it was new, we almost always went with it because it was new. And with one writer and me overnight, and I'm trying to do a 2-hour show, you just are regurgitating the previous day's news. So you'll take whatever you can get. And usually, just logistically, you couldn't show bodies because the police wouldn't let the stringer get close enough to the scene. So what you had was flashing lights, essentially. So, there were definitely things we didn't cover. But most of it was logistic rather than ethical. Our limitations. I will say really quickly, one of my favorite overnight whether or not to do the story thing was when Gus Van Sant got arrested for a Dewey. We saw the name. Yeah, we saw the name come over or heard it, or we saw it. We knew it was him. And my coworker at the time, Erin Givens, who you both know, she was like, well, we should get a statement from the police. I'm like, you will not call the police about a Dewey at 3 a.m. And she said, I'm going to do it. He's supposed to answer the phone. And she calls and he just absolutely lays into her and hangs up on her. And it's not a
that
great
doesn't
story,
happen anymore. They answer the phone 24/7 now. Portland's a different place than it was 15 years ago.
Brian Schmautz wasn't having it.
And I will say that I started in news in the mid 90s, and I interned and then PA'd for a Sunbeam station, and they were like the flashy alliteration, really quick stories. If it bleeds, it leads kind of place. And I was still in college at the time. And that's the way the news was going in the 90s. It's totally different now. A couple weeks ago, we had a discussion about why we don't go to more breaking news. And the answer was, that's not what we cover. That's not what impacts the most people. There are certain stations that kind of their whole thing is breaking news and just get it on the air. And we don't have the resources. And we also, like, is this barn fire really going to have a huge impact on someone? Do we want to send a crew 45 minutes away to cover a fire? And so we don't. So we keep people on more issue-oriented stories. And I don't think we've ever done that as well as we do now. And I think because news is struggling, we don't have as many reporters, we don't have as many photographers, we don't have as many people back here. News is struggling, so we've been forced to tell more in-depth stories and spend more time on those stories. And I think it's worked out for everyone's benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just say something about the bleeds. If it bleeds, it leads. That's kind of it's not literal. It's not, we're not after blood. If it bleeds, it leads means if it's new, if it's interesting, if it affects people, if it's compelling, that's what the story is. If it bleeds, it leads. It's kind of a misleading statement. It's kind of a joke. If it bleeds, it leads. But what we mean is, if there's a bad accident on the traffic on the interstate and it's backing up traffic like crazy, that's really immediately affecting people. We're going to get it on the air.
Despite all this, I think a lot of people who watch TV news, or maybe even people who don't watch a lot of TV news, think that what's happening in this LA newsroom in Nightcrawler is close to reality.
Mm-hmm. But you guys you've been to LA, you've seen the news there. It is very different, I think, than how normal.
Yeah, it's more like Miami, where it's super flashy. It's not as, cerebral as a Seattle or a Portland or a Boston. Every news market's different. They all have different styles.
I can say though, like my wife's family is from Los Angeles, and I just remember how afraid my grandmothers-in-law were to go outside to drive down the street, and it was 100% because of television news, because there's so many carjackings and minor property crimes and things like that, muggings. They were just afraid to go out. You know what I mean? And I think there is something to be criticized about that, because it has a real impact on people's lives. I mean,
and what you're saying is it's not disappropriate to the amount of times that crime happens. It's disappropriate to how it gets covered.
Exactly. Yeah. The crime is happening at the same rate, more or less everywhere. It's just they're focusing on this rather than the things Angelica was just talking about. And
one of the
things I liked, Nick, was that they used real newscasters in this movie.
Oh yeah.
They're real people. One of them, Ken Shocknick, he's been in LA for 30, he just retired, but he's been in TV shows and movies all over the place. And all the other newscasters were real people down there. There were no fake stand-ups like, some actor playing a reporter going, "Are you rolling? I'm Carl Click and I'm reporting live." I mean, that didn't happen. The news people on the air were real, and they seemed like they were acting the way real news people would.
It was perfect. I noticed that throughout the whole film. I didn't know they were all real. I thought some of them might be actors. And I kept thinking to myself, man, I've worked with that guy. Man, I've worked with that woman. They were really great. And you're right. Like up close and personal. I don't know if you guys have seen that when, God, what's her name?
Michelle Pfeiffer.
Michelle Pfeiffer is like live from the inside of a prison with a camera that's not connected to any kind of
cable
technology. And I mean, at least we didn't have to deal with that kind of baloney. But the I don't even want to say acting. The news people in it were great. The anchors on the set when Jake Gyllenhaal's character is meeting them in the hallway, that's exactly what some news anchor is going to say when he comes off the set. Says hi to you. Thanks for the video. That was great. I thought that was really good.
Mm-hmm.
I
any local Portland people who've been on the air? Because I do in movies, like Nancy Francis was in Benji the Hunted way back in the 80s. Brenda Braxton was in a movie once. Gianola was in one where there was a big crash. He was covered in the tunnel. And then they did documentary now for Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
And Amy Troy, Ken Bodie, there were a whole bunch of people. Pat Boyle from radio was all over Portlandia for several of their seasons. It's kind of fun to see people do that. I actually went on a couple of auditions, never got the part, but I actually went in and auditioned to be the news person of the story.
And you have to join SAG-AFTRA when you do that, right?
I wouldn't know. I didn't get the part.
Because I did like a 10-second clip for Jeopardy when they were shooting at Powell's, where I did like one of the clues during the commercial. And I had to join the union.
Whoa.
Yeah, it was crazy. 10 seconds. It was probably 7 seconds. But I think all of those real life journalists who end up in movies do that. And then they get those, 30-cent checks for a long time.
Anna Canzano's been in some stuff as
That's
well.
right.
I think wasn't she in the Netflix show? The name I'm totally escaping. It's a comedy where the kids draw the dicks on the cars. She was in the second season of that.
I know which show you're talking about.
So good. And I can't
remember. They should have cast me in that show.
You would have been guilty.
And she was also the voice on a Lil Dicky video. If you're familiar with Lil Dicky from the show Dave on FX, he's a white Jewish rapper. And she was like the voiceover person for one of his music videos, but in a news style. So
yeah, perfect.
I think that would be really fun.
Anna. Yeah, if they make a movie about the Oregon City girls' murders, Anna should be cast in that for sure.
Absolutely,
as herself.
Yes, exactly. She'd be great as herself.
So we talked about some of the things that didn't work, and we've talked a little bit about some of the things that did work. What else is there here? I guess, how true do you think this is in spirit to some of the issues we should be talking about with news?
Stringers are real. I don't know that they use them quite as much now, because it used to be, you went off the air at 11:30 and then the morning news didn't start till 6. So there's that big window where, news directors, news departments didn't want to pay a photographer the union rate to be there all night to cover those things. So they would have people just like Jake Gyllenhaal's character. The guy in Portland that I remember was a guy named Gordon. And Gordon would drive around all overnight with his camera gear. He had a car that looked like a cop car, and it had a spotlight on it. And if he got something of interest, he'd call the station. And standard rate was like about $50. And he'd sell to all 4 stations. If you got something really good, which was rare, he could try to get an exclusive and get more money out of people. But as soon as you do that, you break your relationship with those other stations. So we would run Gordon stuff about 2-3 times a week if there was a fire overnight or a bad accident or some crime situation. He was a real contributor to Portland news throughout the 80s and the 90s.
We still use stringers, not very often, just because honestly, there's so many people out there shooting with their cell phones willing to give it to a TV station for free for a credit. That's really kind of bombing out the stringers out there. It's cutting into their business. I mean, there's 5 videos of every fire or car accident. And most of the time, if you ask someone if you can use it, they'll say, yeah, sure, use it. Put my name on the screen.
Yeah. When I was doing overnights, there were 2 main stringers, and Gordon, I think, had retired or something by then. But I'm not going to say their names because I don't have wholly positive things to say about them. But one guy always came in just reeking of cigarettes and not showering for 4 days. but he was good. He got his stuff. And then another guy showed up on scene, and he honestly, the Jake Gyllenhaal character reminded me of this guy. There was just something missing from him.
Sociopathic.
Yes, and he would always like try to be super professional sounding, but you could just, there was this strain of desperation underneath it all, and he just really gave me the willies. So I tried not to buy his stuff just because I didn't want to deal with him.
I just thought Jake Gyllenhaal's character was so good, and just the way he kind of slithers his way into this news organization and just kind of showing you what a slippery slope it is. You know, starts with, you know, the car on fire, and what, at the end of the movie, we end up with his partner dying on the street with his eyes open. This plot was insane.
Yeah, that's where we get to the second level of ethical question.
Well, but I mean, it illustrates how sociopathic his character is, and then it brings to mind those larger ethical concerns about the news business, and what you were talking about there with issues that really affect people versus things that may take your breath away as a shock value thing. And it's interesting to me that as news has gone on, we do see more and more shock type stories or sensationalized stories, and how it's sort of a self-defeating approach, because the more you do this sort of stuff, the less credibility you have, and then fewer people watch, and then you do it to get more people to watch, and then you lose, you know what I mean? It's a negative cycle, as opposed to doing actual journalism like Angelica was talking about. So I don't know if I have a point
it really varies station by station, management company by management, and consultants. Obviously, consultants have a big role in what kind of news, your mission. And so if you're that station that promises breaking news 24/7, one Portland station does this, then that's what you're going to cover. And that's going to be your priority. You're going to pull the reporter who's been working for 2 days on an in-depth piece on, government corruption or something else, and you're going to send them to the triple murder. That's just how it goes. Yeah.
And I do think this movie really underscores sort of this, what can be like a sense of desperation underneath a lot of news people, especially when you're in management. Your life cycle as a news manager is short. Nobody lasts too long, especially in modern news. So there is obviously this is heightened, of course, but there is a sense of desperation that you've got to come in, you've got to make an impact, you've got to change things to improve things. And it isn't necessarily to the viewer or the community's benefit.
And we all know that managers think about the target demo, and they make decisions on what to cover based on that. I've only had 1 or 2 managers in all the years I've been doing this who openly talk about it in editorial meetings. And fortunately, there's usually some pushback if people don't agree on the story. Carl and I worked for one of them, and, they dubbed it, "What does Tanya from Troutdale want to see on the news today?" And it was, it's disheartening when you're, you're trying to do news that appeals to the wider audience, that's important to people, and it doesn't check off all the boxes because we might not score the right demo.
So in that movie, the overnight news director is really worried about ratings, and they want to hit the crime stuff. And that's obviously why she kind of adopts the Stringer mentality from Jake Gyllenhaal. There was one point where they had some really graphic video. It was really compelling, really graphic. It was obtained basically illegally, but she's in the ear talking to the anchors as they talk over it. You know that scene?
Yeah.
And so Angelica and I have had producers in our ear during live breaking news just like that. It probably was Nick sometimes. And in that case, the producer is providing information and facts, or where we're going next. But at no point did any producer ever get in my ear and say, "Hit it harder, say the word vengeance, say the word victim." It's horrific. It's never been about the emotional impact, because basically the pictures tell that story by themselves. It's always just been facts and data to provide. So that was difficult for me to watch.
Yes. It just reinforced the stereotype that we're just talking heads being fed information from someone else. I mean, when we do storm coverage, the producers don't tell us anything. We've got 5 hours of us just ad-libbing. The only thing they're really telling us is you're going to Melanie next, or you're going to this person next. But that never happens unless you misspeak and say a word incorrectly. Sometimes a producer will be like, oh, nope, 10, and you can go back and correct yourself, but that rarely happens.
The best example of this is in the movie Broadcast News, where Holly Hunter's character is talking to William Hurt's character, breaking news about jet fighters in Libya or what's ever going on. And it's excellent because he asks the question, and while the person is answering, she gives him more information about what happened and where they're going next. That's the best scene of that entire movie, because William Hurt describes it. It's almost like good sex. We're going back and forth and blah,
Yeah,
blah, blah,
true.
blah.
True.
That's the best example of how that really happens.
Yeah, and I've always found too that it's hard to say too much into someone's ear because you forget they are talking and they have to think about what they're saying. So it's kind of challenging. I don't know. Carl, you gave me some.
You usually talk to the person that's not talking. If Angelica's talking, you'll talk
I'm
to me.
alone all morning, so you can't do that anymore.
Or you do it while the subject is talking.
Yeah.
I forgot you don't have a co-host?
No.
Wow. I don't wake up before, you're off the air ever. So
yeah, I'm alone.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you're doing 2.5 hours now?
Usually someone else does the 4:30 to 5, depends on the day, but 5 to 7. I actually kind of like having that kind of control. It's easier to set the tone, and I have the rest of the people I work with, Rhonda Shelby, Hannah Olson, Evan Schreiber, they're all kind of my co-anchors. I consider Rhonda my co-anchor and Hannah my co-anchor. I mean, they're in the show and woven in so often that it's like a ensemble cast. It's not like I'm just sitting out there all lonely by myself.
Anybody else in the market doing that, or are you the only one?
The only one.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm surprised too.
And you got a pay raise too when you took over the entire show.
Big time.
Twice the work, twice the pay. That's what they say.
Nick, did anything about this movie? This is a dumb question. I know the answer. Anything make you miss television news?
Kind of. And here's what it is. There is a certain sense of excitement when something is happening. I do get some of that excitement still producing live sports, but there is a sense of like, we're doing something here. There's adrenaline there. I mean, I don't miss the stress that it causes. I don't miss being up overnight. I think too, at least in my producing experience, so they have time while they're producing these shows to debate the moral questions and the decisions you're making about what goes where and what leads and what doesn't. And like when I was producing overnights, again, even when they gave me another producer, so I was only doing an hour, it's still so much work that you can't stop what you're doing to talk about stuff. You just decide right then and there what it's going to be. Maybe you'll say, hey, what do you think? And that's it. That's all there is to it. So, I mean, that was a little unrealistic, but no,
especially on a morning shift, which is what you produced. I mean, the grind is really tough overnights. During daytime, when you're producing, the evening news, there's a little bit more time to massage the show and kind of talk about the presentation and the showcasing and what angles you want to cover. Morning news is more like radio, where you're just banging it out. You want people to get all the information before they head out the door. So you guys aren't sitting there having long editorial meetings.
Well, we also don't have new stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of new stuff. So you're really just trying to think about the ways that whatever happened yesterday is most applicable to what is happening today. Yeah. But the other thing, honestly, that I found working morning shows versus daytime shows is morning shows, when there wasn't a boss there, that changed after I was producing. They brought in an executive producer, but when I was there, I was the final decision maker for everything because I was the only person in the building. And so it was a huge shock for me then, when I did move to Dayside, to have someone there saying, no, don't do that. And then for me, in a way, I liked producing the morning show better because I got to be creative and make decisions, and everything I decided in the Dayside was overruled constantly.
Micromanaged.
I just got to the point where I would just literally say to this two particular people above me, well, just tell me what you want and I'll do it. And they're like, no, I really need you to come up with, why don't you, you can make decisions. I want you to be creative. And it's like, every time I do, you tell me I'm wrong. Just tell me.
That was the joy of the morning show. It was the counterpoint to, you have to get up really early, or in Nick's case, be there over all night.
More creative freedom for sure.
Yeah.
I wonder, Carl, do you miss that adrenaline rush?
I would agree with Nick. I think I missed the live news portion of it, where something happens and we've got to do our job and do it well and work in a team. It's like a basketball game, producing or coaching or whatever. I mean, that happens. The rest of it, not that much at all. I've been pretty clean break when I got out of it. I did have one story, very Stringer-like, I wanted to tell you, because this involved a photographer who was employed by the station, but he had Stringer-like mentality. I'm not going to mention his name. This was back in the 80s, but he loved shooting fires. And he would, if there was a fire, he got there in a hurry. And he would sleep at night with his earpiece in, listening to police scanners, which is part of this movie, the police scanners. And if there was a fire, he was out of bed and on his way shooting it. And he just loved it. And he was so good. First of all, he made a lot of money in overtime because he was working, 4 hours overnight. But he got so good at it that law enforcement thought he might be an arsonist. You know how arsonists would show up at their fires and watch them? He was at every single fire. So they started tailing him. And at one point, legend has it, he was driving down Interstate Fire, listening to the scanner of the people who were following him and tailing him because they thought he was an arsonist.
Wow. That's pretty incredible. I thought watching Nightcrawler that because I didn't look up, specifics on the plot. I actually thought that that's what this movie would turn into. I thought he was going to get desperate after the first couple of wins where he sold his video and realized, well, why wait around and listen to the scanner when I can just kill someone myself or light a fire myself or rob someone myself? Also, what happened to the guy whose watch he stole? Is that guy dead or did he just knock him out?
He just beat him up and stole his watch. Yeah.
Okay. I thought that that's where the movie was going to. I don't want to say a much darker place because it ended up just as dark, I guess, in a different way. But I thought he would be the criminal.
Well, he is, though. I mean, he set up at the end of the movie. He set up those guys to have that confrontation with the cops. And I was reading from Dan Gilroy, who wrote it. One of the reasons at the beginning they show him beating up that guy and taking his watch is to show that he was a criminal the entire time. The business didn't turn him into
he was a thief beforehand and realized this was just a way to seemingly do it above board, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. He's a hustler. This is just another hustle for him, another con essentially to pull off. Another interesting thing to me about this movie is that there's no backstory provided whatsoever for Jake Gyllenhaal's character. All we know is he's not a good guy. He's a liar and a sociopath, and that's pretty evident right up front. We don't learn where he grew up, what his parental situation is like. We learn nothing about him. And I think that's actually really smart. In most movies, I'd say, I want to know something about this character, but you don't need to in this movie.
Yeah.
You know totally what he's motivated by.
Totally agree that he was plain and simple that con man, that crook, small time, but then he becomes big time with where he ends up.
Yeah, so he looks a lot like my brother-in-law, John, too, which was another reason I was so freaked out and I was so anxious. I just kept, John, why are you doing this? This is not good, dude. I mean, he was really good. I don't know. I didn't read a lot of the reviews on this film. I'm assuming it got really good reviews because the acting was great.
Yeah, it got really good reviews. It made quite a bit of money for the budget. It was like an $8 million budget. It made $50 million. It was nominated for a Best Original Screenplay Oscar. It's like 8 or 9 stars on the Rotten Tomatoes and all that. Yeah.
I would say it deserves that, even though it ruined my Saturday morning and I was full of anxiety. I definitely think it deserved that.
Yeah. Would you guys recommend this movie to other people?
I would, as long as they go into it understanding that it's an exaggeration of what the industry's like.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I have to think about that because every time I tell someone what I do, I get a smart ass response and I'm sick of it. I'm still working in TV news and I actually avoid the conversation. Nick and I have talked about this before. I don't know if Carl, you probably handled this better than me when you were in the business, but when you're at a dinner party or cocktail party and people are like, what do you do? Well, I work for a TV station. What do you do at the TV station? I work in the news department. What do you do in the news department? I'm a journalist. What kind of journalist? I'm always avoiding the question because when I say news anchor, they're like, oh, we don't watch the news. And it's like, oh, 20 minutes on why you think the news sucks.
Yeah. I I feel the same way. When like I'm on the golf course a lot these days. If you don't know somebody, they ask you questions. Hey, well, what do you do? Well, I'm retired. Well, what did you do? I was a journalist. Oh, really? What kind? I worked at a TV station. I take as long as I can to
Yes.
get to that point that makes everybody get to,
Yeah.
where Angelica eventually gets to.
And it's never been worse than it is now, I think, as far as just not wanting to deal with whatever the person's going to say, depending on what circles. If it's like 60-plus-year-old women, they want to take you out for a glass of wine and ask you every question in the world about TV news because they still love watching TV news and they trust it. But if it's a millennial or a Gen Z person, yeah.
But doesn't that get back to the theme of this movie? And that news is killing, in some ways, killing itself in the way that it is presenting information. Obviously, not just the sensationalization of crime, but with politics and all these news, quote unquote, outlets popping up. And so if you're not sophisticated, you don't know what's real and what's fake. You don't know who you can trust and who you can't. And I think that speaks back to what we're talking about.
That's where all the distrust came from. Absolutely.
So, I mean, it's just frustrating. It's funny too, because when I tell people that I used to work in news, everyone says, "Oh, wow, I bet you missed that." I'm like, why would I know? No, I don't. But thank you. But it's weird though. It lends me more credibility with them too, though, when I say that what I used to do versus what I do now. Because when I say people now, I produce television for a school district, it's almost like patting the slow kid on the head. Oh, that's nice. But I used to work in them. Oh, okay. You're real then. You're not like just some guy with, you know what I'm saying? It's funny how that works.
See, I feel differently. I feel like everyone thinks my job's bullshit. Like I think
Angelica, that's what they say, but I don't think they believe that.
You might be right about that. And it depends on the part of my job I'm talking about. If I'm talking about anchoring a morning newscast and they're like, oh God. But if I say, no, I do specialty reporting, I cover the homeless crisis, the housing crisis, then they're a little bit more interested. And you're going to get that in Portland. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you guys if you've ever gotten into any, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you guys if you've ever gotten into any debates in news where you really felt firmly that we were doing the wrong thing and you fought for it. Did that ever happen to you, Carl?
It happened all the time. I mean, it happened, yes. The one example I can think of is at one point we were really in the morning news, we were really into, breaking news, new stuff. So anything happening on the East Coast was important, and we would always get that into that last hour of news. At one point when Charlie Sheen was just going off the rails, there was some story about him like going to the hospital or something like that. And the script that I was handed said, "We have breaking news about Charlie Sheen." And the way that I presented it, I was kind of sarcastically. I said, "Well, I guess we're calling this breaking news now, but Charlie Sheen XYZ." Because he had been in the news regularly over several weeks. But I said, I guess we're calling this breaking news because they had the banner up and I read the script. And the producer got all over me saying, we've got to be on the same page. We're either, if you're fighting me because this is the decision I've made, we have a problem. And she was right. My problem was it was just the fact that we were going to call that breaking news. And then that discussion came up really quickly with the consultant who was there within a couple of days. And they basically said, yeah, that's breaking news because people are talking about it. And so you want to present it that way. And I had to acquiesce. I had to say, okay. But on the air, I said, well, I guess we're calling this breaking news, Charlie Sheen, blah, blah, blah.
Well, and I think that the word consultant just popped up, and I think that's a whole other topic probably. But I mean, if you want to talk about things that make the news business worse, consultants can be that. I think that, again, that's a whole other topic. But like as far as like getting in arguments over the content of what we cover, typically I didn't get in too many of those because, again, after a while my will was broken. But I felt like there were times I would have a whole show put together and I would be forced, again, when I was producing the 4, I was doing a full hour with no writer, and I didn't even have the luxury of the overnight's material to incorporate into my show. So I was just getting crushed like every day, and I hated my job. I would finally get this show ready, and then at 3:00, some piddly, meaningless breaking news would happen, and I would be told that I had to dump what I had prepared for this baloney story. There's a car crash on you know what it,
Yeah.
nothing consequential. So those were fights I got into sometimes, but I always lost those fights. And then I would also sometimes get into fights about how we present, kind of what Carl was saying, how we phrase things, how we present things.
Yeah.
One in particular, and again, not to go too political here, but abortion. Every time I would write anti-abortion, I had a superior who would change it to pro-life. And I think
that doesn't happen anymore. That's crazy.
Yeah, you and I have had this conversation before,
yeah.
but that happened.
We have
with
very
one
strict
particular
rules about how you address abortion, and I never have had a problem as an anchor. And that as anchors, especially when you're the only one in the morning, you kind of play a managing editor role. So I feel like, some of our producers are in their mid to early 20s to mid 20s, and they don't have a lot of experience. So if I say, yeah, we're not going to do it like that, they listen to me and they trust my judgment. And we just, I make the call on the air, or I see the way it's written and I don't like it. And so I'll just ad lib over it. So there's an easy way to deal with that. But when I was a reporter in Boston, there was one legendary incident that people still text me every 6 months making a joke about it. I was out on a story. There was a dog named Dudley. Dudley was a dachshund on Cape Cod who, this is really kind of a sad story. His owner was on the toilet. It was an elderly man and was going to the bathroom and had a heart attack in the bathroom. He was I think he was in his early 90s. And Dudley was found a couple days later. Someone showed up, found granddad. He was still alive, unconscious, but still alive. It was the next day or something. And Dudley had blood all over him. And the guy, this is graphic, but the guy's genitalia, that whole area had been chewed up. So he was bleeding out, and his little doggy was there. So animal control got involved, picked up the dog. Police are saying that the dog got hungry and was feeding off of his owner. So I get sent down there. I'm like, why are we doing this story? This is awful. There's no viewer benefit to this at all. This is just gruesome and weird. And this poor guy's still alive on life support. His family's going to see this. And also, it is absolute crap that Dudley ate his owner's balls. Dogs don't get hungry in 12 hours and eat the one person that they love so much, right? He's not going to do that. And I was fighting with the producer. My photographer's fighting. And he's like, well, you're the lead at 6 and I got nothing else. It was one of those situations. I'm screaming, and you guys know I don't hold back. I'm I'm not doing it. I'm like, how do you even want me to describe what happens? I mean, I'm having trouble describing it on a podcast. How am I supposed to do that on TV? So I said, okay, I'm going to go with it. I'm going to attribute all of this to animal control and the police. And we put together the most ridiculous story, and we did it on purpose. And it was meet Dudley the dachshund. And it was very tame. And I said, the man had injuries to the lower parts of his body, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I go home. I'm really pissed off. The next day I get up and I check my email, and it's animal control, and they've CC'd the police department. It wasn't Dudley the dachshund. It was a rat that came out of the toilet because they lived on a cranberry bog in the marshland. And I'm like, that's a story. That's an actual story. I mean, I don't want to cover it, but. And so every 6 months or so, someone from that newsroom, they're like, how you doing? And they send me a little, a meme or a GIF of a little dachshund in my phone. And I'm like, oh God.
So I just hope you use the word alleged and accused Dudley the dog, because you didn't want to convict him on the air.
I didn't want to convict poor Dudley. I knew he was innocent, and I was vindicated the next day. And I still have the tape. It's in my desk in the newsroom. I kept it. And it was the stupidest story I've ever done. And I kind of regret just not saying, yeah, well, I'll get written up. I'm not putting this on the air.
Wow. How do we top that to end the show? Where do we go from there?
I just want to know who plays Angelica in the Dudley the Dog movie. Amanda Peet.
No, no. You need
I was
like
listening
Rhea
to you guys,
Perlman or something.
I was listening to your guys' podcast where you guys talk about who you guys get mixed up for. And I'm just screaming, Amanda Peet, Amanda Peet, Amanda Peet.
Man, I wish. No, I get Heidi Fleiss, not Amanda Peet.
We figured it out. She looks like Sean Andrews from Dazed and Confused. That's who she looks like.
I did see that.
I really do.
I've seen pictures of him now, and you still kind of look like you could be siblings.
Yeah, I do. I agree fully. Like he looks more like my brother than my brother does.
Carl, do you ever get anybody?
When he was a lot younger, I got Tom Hanks a little bit when we were okay. But getting back to broadcast news, everybody watched that movie and they said, Albert Brooks, that's you.
Well, you had kind of like a bigger hair like he did in that movie.
Yeah. You had a little bit of a fro.
Because remember, his character moved back to the number 2 station in Portland and was anchor in the mornings.
That's true.
And plus, you sweat so profusely.
Only Angelica was no, because she sat next to me for a whole year and a half.
You know, the cameras were on. We all saw. But, yeah. All right. Well, Carl, thanks for joining us. This was a lot of fun. Where can people find you? Because I know you're doing so much comedy these days. I saw you recently. You were very funny. Where can people see you?
The best thing is the old podcast I did during the pandemic, which is PDX Media Good Old Days, where I interviewed a whole bunch of veterans from Portland TV news and radio. That's a lot of fun. There are about 50 episodes up of that. Other than that, I just send my comedy gigs out to my Facebook friends. So
check your Facebook page then.
Probably, yeah.
So you don't want to say where generally, because you live in a certain part of the state.
Oh, I'm in the Bend area. I'm in Sisters, Oregon.
So if you live in Central Oregon, if you go to a comedy night, there's a pretty good chance you'll see Carl Click singing his profane songs.
Okay. If they're not profane.
Well, no. I was just trying to.
Carl, you didn't even want to say toilet on the news.
I do not have a lot of bad words in my act.
Okay.
No. Just the one big one, and you know which one it is.
Fucking A, man.
Film Swap is produced and hosted by Angelica Thornton and Nick Voll. You can watch or listen on YouTube, Spotify, Anchor, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. Follow Angelica on Twitter at Angelica KATU and follow Nick at Nick Voll. Share your thoughts on the films we discussed there, and we might just read them on the show. Music by John Michael Farley and Nick Voll.